it's absolutely a pleasure for me to host this Thinkers Dialogue once again. This is the episode 5 for the episode. We have had some great guests, but today we have a very special guest. In fact, Rishikesha Krishnan, who's been a friend. I must actually also say that he's been a friend, philosopher, guide for me personally in many, many ways. In fact, I think he has been personally one of my biggest pillars of support in the times of need. So I can't thank him enough. But other than that, actually, on my personal friendship with him and huge regard for the person, Rishi is an acclaimed academic. The most interesting fact about him is that he's got educated from Stanford. But now we just have a little bit of a difference on that, and that is that he got educated from Stanford. I just started teaching at Stanford. Couldn't have happened without Rishi's help and support over a period of time. And then, of course, Rishi has been the director for IIM Indore, but now director for IIM Bangalore. And a very well deserved position, without a doubt. From my point of view, one of the finest academics in India who has actually had the ability to stand up to many, many things. And then, of course, in terms of research, one of the greatest minds in the area of innovation. And if you talk about innovation, he has done multiple books on that. He has written extensively, got published with California Management Review, if I get that right, and many, many others. And of course, he does columns quite frequently. In fact, has been a columnist with various newspapers, Founding Fuel, etc., etc. And that's what it is. So his bio is just way too long. If I just start reading it out, it'll just take an hour. But having said that, Rishi, thanks for being such a great pillar of support and being such a great friend. Thank you. And thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be on this program with you, Amit. And thanks for all the nice things you said about me. Now I have to live up to all that. But yeah, great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Rishi, we'll quickly dive into the conversation on innovation today. But as we get into the conversation, my first question to you is that COVID has been something very, very, what I call, interesting experience or a troubling experience for all of us across the board. How has it affected you, and how are you really looking at post-COVID scenarios or whatever? And how do you think life is going to be impacted?
Well, I think there have been some good effects of COVID. One is, of course, that travel has come down to almost zero. So that's really released a whole lot of extra time, is what I see. So it just tells you and shows you, how inefficient in a way many of our lives were before. And earlier we used to think nothing of taking a flight and going somewhere just to attend a one-hour meeting, but now all those meetings are getting done online. So overall, of course, COVID has also been a pretty troubling period. I mean, to see the kind of vulnerability we have to such a tiny virus and the challenges in combating it. I mean, somewhere along the line, I think we had developed this sense that, we are all powerful, but this tiny virus has kind of really brought us down to our feet in a way.
And so when you talk about this tiny virus getting us on our feet, this is something which has really pushed us into thinking about how do we really redraw or redefine a world. In fact, one of the things that you allude to is that, of course, travel has gone down and how you are effectively looking at time again. But I think it has changed many, many things across us. How do you think it has impacted business?
How it's impacted business? Well, I think it depends a lot on what business you are talking about. So if you look at businesses which were already primarily digital, I think, clearly they've done very well. They've gone from strength to strength. In fact, during this period, you can see it in the numbers. Businesses which were not truly digital before have had to really struggle. They have had to embrace this whole connect with becoming virtual, digital, getting people to work in a very different kind of way. So I think it's had very differential impact depending on what kind of business we are talking about. On the whole, I think many businesses, particularly larger businesses, seem to have coped quite well in terms of making a pretty fast transition. We've seen that in financial services, we've seen that in IT and so on. But yeah, I think some traditional businesses have also struggled during this period.
So, Rishi, when you say that businesses have struggled, and there are a set of businesses which have done well, what enabled some of those businesses to move ahead and do better? what were the principles that were defining it, and how do you really look at this whole aspect from innovation point of view?
Yeah, so I think it's the companies which have done well at this. Of course, the obvious things like they're probably quite agile, flexible, and all that. But I think it also just reflects the fact that maybe some of them had sort of thought through some of these things earlier. Maybe not exactly in terms of COVID, but in terms of what is the kind of transition required. I'm a pretty big believer in the importance and utility of scenario planning. And you probably remember, Amit, in the early oil crisis in the 70s, one oil company, Shell, weathered the crisis much better than others. Not because Shell was better at predicting or forecasting when the oil shocks were going to happen, but simply because Shell had this practice of trying to look at different possible scenarios that might come up in the future and thinking through how would they respond. So I think there's some evidence that the companies which have been fast in responding, apart from the typical agility and flexibility, maybe they also thought through some alternate scenarios in terms of contingency planning. And when not exactly the same scenario, but something that required major change happened, they were able to embrace that quite easily, or at least relatively easily, let's say.
Yeah, so one was, of course, crystal ball gazing in some way or scenario planning. But do you think innovation was one of the drivers, or there was some different way in which they were looking at enterprises themselves? You said agility, but what else? Like, how do you think the whole principle of innovation was getting embedded within organizations?
Yeah, so typically when we talk about innovation, at least when I talk about innovation, I tend to look at four important pillars of innovation. The first is problem identification. I mean, most business innovation is one way or the other driven by some problem or challenge that the company faces. And then once you have realized that your regular solutions or the kind of standard responses are not going to work, then you start looking for, okay, how do I actually handle this problem? And that's when the whole ideation process kicks in. So we tend to equate ideation with innovation, but ideation is just one part of it. Once you have ideas, you have to figure out whether they actually work, which means you have to experiment, you have to test, you have to mix ideas, match ideas, all that kind of stuff. So that's the sort of execution or experimentation phase, if you like. And then finally, once you've got it all figured out, maybe you scale up and then you start seeing the benefit to different stakeholders. So I think what some of the companies were quite good at doing, the most successful ones, they sort of pretty early on identified that COVID is not going to be just over in a week or 2 weeks. It's not as though they could just close their shutters and wait for it to pass by. But here was a problem at hand, and that this problem would have to be addressed through some fresh thinking. I think they sort of looked around, looked for where they could get ideas from, tried to learn from the companies which had shown agility earlier. And that's, I think, where a lot of them really displayed that sort of alacrity to quickly embrace that kind of innovative thinking.
This is interesting, Rishi, in terms of like how they were looking at things around them. But you yourself have said in the past that there is scope for product, process, and business model innovation, which is huge. Do you think this crisis pushed us towards uh, pushing the what do you call frontier in terms of product innovation or process innovation or business model innovation?
Yeah, again, it depends, I guess, quite a bit, Amit, on what kind of businesses you're talking about. We have seen some companies do extremely well on product innovation. They tend to be the ones in the broader healthcare space, whether it be companies who are trying to identify vaccines or even before vaccines in terms of testing kits. I mean, we know historically that to develop a new vaccine against a virus typically takes 10, 15, 20 years. If you look at in India, for example, we have rotavirus, which is major cause of infant mortality. It took almost 30 years for a low-cost rotavirus vaccine to be developed in India. But you can just see in the case of COVID, in less than a year, you've had companies who've been able to go through the entire process, including testing and all the rest, and take a product to market. So we've certainly seen product innovation. Processes, particularly within the company, have had to change a lot. I think work from home is a good example. Many companies who had very sort of rigid or rigorous policies about employees only working from the office because of confidentiality, data security, and other reasons. They had to just change their internal processes overnight to cope with this. They had to live with whatever challenges there were with employees working from home, and several of them seem to have made that transition very quickly. I mean, TCS is a good example if you're looking for a large company which embraced work for home quite fast. Business model, I think, has been a little more challenging for many companies. They have tried to figure out what is the way to embrace different business models. Of course, the simplest ways were essentially to embrace some kind of digital interface with the customer. So digital payment systems and even simple things like sending emails. I mean, for example, I'm really was very pleasantly surprised to find that I had to surrender a BSNL connection. And typically in the old days, if you had to do anything with BSNL, you had to go and stand in a long queue in the BSNL customer care center. But BSNL is actually accepting, you can write a letter, you can just scan it and send it through email, and they're willing to act on that. So, I mean, even companies like BSNL, which one normally don't look at them as the sort of pioneers or the movers of innovation, they have actually been trying to change their processes and in a way also change their business models because they're trying to look at different ways for making money as well.
Rishi, so as you were saying that, like the product innovation that we have actually seen, healthcare sector being able to reduce the development cycle to about, say, 9 months to 12 months. Do you think that this whole process can actually be learned by other enterprises and other processes or across different sets of products as we go along? Because this is a very big defining moment in time in terms of like how innovation is effectively going to happen.
Yeah, so I think there are some elements of this which are in a way serendipitous and connected to COVID, and some things which you might be able to replicate later. Let's start with the serendipitous stuff. I think one challenge in particularly in companies is resource allocation, and it is having a strategic focus. I mean, a great example of this is a company like Apple. You remember Steve Jobs when he came back and joined Apple for the second time. The first thing he did was he threw out most of the products. He said, "You can't make a good product company by having such a huge product portfolio. Let's just have one or two killer products which really make it." And then he focused all his attention, all his resources on making that happen. In a way, COVID provided that opportunity just by the nature of the pandemic. So you had like pharma companies realizing that COVID is the thing, so we need to focus on that. Maybe let's put aside all the other projects and put them on the back burner and let's focus on that. Sometimes getting that razor like focus in normal times is not easy, because in most companies you tend to want to hedge your bets, you want to have a portfolio, and all those kind of thought processes come into play, unless you're like somebody like Steve Jobs, who is a innovation guru, and you're absolutely sure this is what is going to work, and you put your money and resources and everything behind it. I think that's one dimension of this. Some things, of course, are quite transferable. For example, you can see the kind of cycle times. You can see the sort of even the more unique testing methods. I mean, for example, when people were trying to develop testing kits, they needed ways of checking out whether the testing kits were effective or not. And the virus sort of what are they, not samples or whatever they call it, which you need to test your kit on, were not easily available. So you needed to find smart ways of testing your kit. So that ingenuity, I think, is sort of transferable to the post COVID era as well. So essentially you're going to have different elements of that. The third part of it, which is quite interesting, is the regulatory issues. If you look at typically in a regulated industry, one of the challenges that causes long delays in approvals of products is the regulatory process, particularly things like drugs and healthcare and so on. But you can see the alacrity with which the regulatory agencies have moved during this COVID pandemic to ensure that both the testing kits as well as the vaccines and everything else got very very quick approval. So I think that's something which governments and regulators are going to have to grapple with in the post COVID era, to see how can they provide that kind of support, because otherwise many of these things just take years and years to come to market.
So, Rishi, like just digressing onto one side, like you made a very important point, and that was how regulatory challenges were overcome. So that means there has been a huge governance innovation somehow that has actually happened, even though, of course, it was driven by crisis. Do you think countries would actually be able to imbibe this? Because if you're able to innovate, because it becomes a process innovation for government in many ways. Like if they do that, I think delivery of services for citizens would actually be hugely impacted in a positive way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Amit, and I think that's going to be a big challenge, particularly for India. And why so? Because if you just look at the actions which the government took, say something like from about May, June last year, particularly in all these areas we have been talking about, setting up a consortia of companies, bringing together all the different stakeholders, identifying what are the gaps in the products available which are necessary to combat COVID, then finding companies which have the necessary resources. I was once reading about just the thing they use to take the sample in order to test whether you have COVID or not. They found that even those things were not available. Those buds, I think they are called, they found they were not available. So they found that Reliance had the right material to make the stem for that bud. The uh, but uh, the process of actually assembling it together was something that Johnson and Johnson had in its factory in Bombay. So they had to get J&J and Reliance and all work together so that they could rapidly scale up and make sure millions of those swabs were available to take out the COVID samples. So things like that. And the government really moved very proactively to get different arms of the government to work together. So I don't know how it can be done, but this is going to be a huge challenge. How are we going to sustain that kind of collaborative working in the post COVID era?
Yeah. So, on a side note, like on this exact thing, we have just done a case study for the Ministry for Textiles. So it is already available, exactly documenting as to what had happened. But just coming back to the conversation, uh, when you talk about this whole idea of innovation, uh, it is all driven through intellectual property rights, and especially the industry that you're really talking about. But I think in this crisis, people have shared more information than any time in the history of the system. So, how do you think this might actually impact the whole IPR regimes across the world, or how the global information systems have actually just come together in terms of sharing this information and building something very potent for survival of human race?
Yeah, actually, the IPR situation, unfortunately, Amit, is not that clear because a lot of the innovation these days is driven by data. It's driven by AI and machine learning and a whole lot of the new methods that are coming in. But the intellectual property rights regime which accompanies the data revolution is not really yet in place. I mentioned the regulatory issues also. Regulatory issues are also quite serious. I mean, for example, in Europe, we already have things like the GDPR, and the GDPR requires AI algorithms to be transparent and it should be accountable and so on. I think it's not yet really. I mean, companies have not quite hit up against those things yet, but it's going to happen. And they're very basic things. Like, for example, suppose you're trying to train your algorithm for which you use data. Suppose you use somebody else's data, would you be infringing some law? I mean, for example, you might conceivably be infringing copyright law, but is that a good thing to happen? I mean, should that kind of a copyright protection be there for using somebody else's data to train your AI algorithm? So there are the huge unresolved issues in this whole data and AI space, which need very urgent resolution if we are not going to have significant IPR challenges in innovation going forward. I mean, IPR issues in fields like pharma and all are fairly well established in that way. You're right. During COVID, the barriers to collaboration have come down. The Covishield vaccine is a great example. Oxford University, AstraZeneca, and companies like the Serum Institute all collaborating with each other, and with, I think, reasonably agreeable commercial terms. So I mean, nobody is trying to really completely exploit the other. Everybody is benefiting from it. But yeah, it's again, sorry, and it's not very clear that this will just automatically continue once COVID is over.
Yeah, so just moving a step ahead onto this, like of course there is this IP and how things change, but there are enterprises who generally do not appreciate the aspect of importance of IP and appreciate that this can be the basis for competitive advantage. How do you really look at that situation? Because that gets very closely aligned to what you have been saying in the past as well, like the idea of moving from jugaad innovation to systemic innovation. So,
Yeah.
now, how do you really look at the situation?
I think it depends a lot on the sector, Amit. One reason, for example, in India, we have not seen so much focus on IPR is because we are not present in a big way in the sectors where IPR is critical. I mean, for example, if you were to make a list of the top patent grantees in the world, you would see that the top 10 companies are all in some way in electronics, semiconductors, computers, things like that. But those are not the industries in which India has a big presence. We tend to be except for pharma, maybe, but even pharma, typically, we have traditionally been more on the process side than on the product side. Again, the product companies are very heavily into IP, but the process companies are not so much focused on IP. And in India, the three top industries as far as R&D spend are pharma, transportation, and IT, broad sectors. Transportation, yes, the emerging areas of transportation, like the whole electronics and computers that are going into cars and trucks, that is of course an IP led area. In fact, Ford is today in one of the top 10 IP holders in the world because of its focus on car electronics. But again, we don't have strong presence in that. We largely have multinationals operating in India. Indian cars in general have a very much lower level of electronic intensity than, say, a typical car outside. So one of the reasons we have not embraced IP so closely is also because of the industries in which we are strong. Again, if you take IT, we have been strong in services, which is not the kind of business in which IP plays a very critical role. It's more in products and technology that plays a bigger role. So I think India's relative, I don't want to call it backwardness, but let's say relative, being relatively behind on IP is partly because of the industries in which we have focused traditionally. Hopefully, with all these new missions, like the quantum computing mission and many of the new initiatives that are on the anvil now, we'll start taking a more proactive role in emerging technologies. When we do that, then IP will in a way follow. It'll be inevitable. You can't be a player in emerging technologies if you're not also embracing IP.
So, like recently in the economic survey, which was just released on the 29th of January, it was said that Indian enterprises are not really focusing on R&D and they're not spending enough. So it goes back to exactly the point to what you were saying, that is it the industry problem or is it what do you call a problem of enterprises as well?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both. I have my own hypothesis on this, so I'll tell you what that hypothesis is. So, I have a feeling that, many of our traditional business houses, which are essentially the way industry in India is structured, they understand finance and trading and all that stuff very well, but they don't really traditionally at least understand R&D and technology that well. So they were quite content to get technology from somebody else and focus on the other aspects of business which they understood. So the companies which have embraced R&D and technology have tended to be those where the family members themselves or some key member in the family has himself or herself got into technology. So you can see examples. You look at somebody like, you look at the Mahindra group, when Anand Mahindra started getting involved and, he started spending time and, getting behind some of those investment decisions. Or you take Ratan Tata, when Tata Motors was investing in the Nano, or even when they acquired Daewoo trucks in Korea. So you need one of those key figures from the owning family who is willing to get his or her hands dirty, into the technology and the innovation space. If that doesn't happen, generally you don't see it. The reason, for example, pharma was relatively R&D focused is because we had some really good technocrats who understand the domain well. You look at Anji Reddy in DRL, you look at Parvinder Singh in Ranbaxy, you look at all of them. You look at Cipla, you look at Mr. Hamid, Dr. Hamid and Cipla. These are all people who understand technology well, and therefore they don't hesitate to invest in R&D and technology and wait to see the results. When you don't understand the stuff and you're dependent on some R&D team, and you're not fully confident whether those guys are going to make it or not, I think it's quite difficult to make big investments in R&D. So I think one big change we need is we need more and more of the people who are the owners or the promoters, as we call them in India. They need to get their fingers deep into these technology and innovation issues.
So there are three distinct players in this whole innovation issue. So like one is very clearly what the government can do. So the government does create that ecosystem. Businesses will have to take some steps. But what about, say, something like the student community, if I really talk about it, you come from that field. Like India does have close to about 1 million engineers that come out each year to a huge number of MBAs, which is close to about at least 1.5 lakh MBAs each year. But then what we do find is that there is very less what I call development of unique sets of ideas or whatever. There seems to be much more copying of ideas from the West. But why does that actually happen? Like, where is it that that ecosystem is not performing?
Yeah, so I think we do have to lay some of the blame on our education system, whether we like it or not. Generally, in Indian education, if you try to do something original, for example, in the exam, if you try to write an answer which is different from what's in the textbook, you're asking for trouble. You'll really be depending on getting a really enlightened examiner who will recognize the merit in your answer and give you marks. So I think that's one challenge of the whole thing. An associated challenge is also, even at home, everybody's focused on just somehow getting the thing done rather than you are displaying your ingenuity. I keep telling this story. There was a used to be an advertisement by one of the leading printer companies on TV, which you might have seen. So this is late in the evening on a Sunday, and the kid suddenly realizes he has a project to submit the next day, and the parents then get all flustered, and they immediately go and get him a HP printer. Sorry, I shouldn't use that word, but the company's printer. And the whole family is now working to help this kid make the project in time so that he can go and get the best marks the next day. And yes, lo and behold, he does. But that's completely defeating the purpose of the project, right? The project was supposed to be done by the kid, not by the parents and the family and so on. So I think this education and the way our families operate in a way sort of stand in the way of innovation. The other thing is confidence. I think that is growing, which is a good thing. That's why I'm really happy to see that there's a new generation of entrepreneurs who seems to be much more confident than the earlier one. But you need to be really confident to be obstinate that you have the right idea. I mean, just look at a guy like Elon Musk, right? He has a lot of these crazy ideas. I mean, when he first started talking about his new model for transportation in hyperloop and pods and all, people thought he was utterly crazy. But you can see that some of those ideas, I mean, many of his ideas don't make it, but lots of his ideas finally do revolutionize the industries they're in. But but he's unfazed. I mean, people are calling him names, people are writing nasty things about him on social media. He couldn't care less. He's got these ideas and he's standing for those ideas. So you need a tremendous amount of confidence if you want to stand up for distinctive ideas of your own. And lastly, I think we have to also to give a little bit of the blame to the investment community. I mean, the investment community in India tends to be very sort of playing safe. If you go to them with an idea, the first question they'll probably ask you is, which is the global company which you are like. they'll immediately want an analogy. So the moment you, so that's you're sunk, right? Because you're straight away on the imitative path, because you have to be like Amazon, or you have to be like whatever Uber or whatever it is. So I think so. These are some of the reasons I think we sort of finding it difficult to break out from that imitative mode and get into the original mode.
And so, what more can be done? So, like, if I you come from the education field itself, what do you think education system should do to really push this forward? Like, one is, of course, you need to create that independence, seek openness, and everything. But what else can be done? And I think it needs to start at the school level. It does not need to come at the level of, say, an engineering school or an MBA school.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it all. It's already there. I mean, for example, you see some of the kids who are doing the IB curriculum. A lot of big cities now, lots of kids go to IB schools, right? So you can see their whole way of looking at things is quite different. There are a lot of open-ended questions. There are projects. The projects don't have well-defined kind of right answers. A whole lot of that stuff actually is already happening. In a way, we are sort of slowly trying to recreate that system. I mean, for example, all these Atal tinkering labs, they're a great, I think, place for kids to try things out. I only hope they are working the way they are supposed to, because traditionally in India, if you had something like a lab, it will be under lock and key, and the key would be with the teacher. I just hope the tinkering labs are genuinely open and available to all the kids, so they can be trying things out in the lab. But I think that's the way to go. We really need to open up. We need to encourage kids, and I think that there is stuff happening, but it needs to be on a much bigger scale.
So that's a very positive news, as you really say. Uh, just moving ahead on this, in fact, let's come back to the enterprises once again. And when you talk about enterprises, like, you have talked about the idea of leadership and the importance of leadership. Uh, where do you think they can actually have an impact on how enterprises work as they move forward towards their journey towards innovation and things?
Yeah, so today I think the leadership has a great role to play, and that's the role of what we call the orchestrator of experiments. So let me explain what that means. So you just remember a few minutes ago I was talking about the innovation process, and I was emphasizing the importance of a lot of experimentation with new ideas. One of the big problems used to be that experimentation was expensive, experimentation was difficult, you needed test setups, all that stuff. But today, in a digital world, the ease of experimentation has certainly increased quite a bit. Particularly if you're in a digital or a quasi-digital company, the cost of experimentation is very low. So there's absolutely no excuse for not doing lots and lots of experiments. So earlier, when we did not have enough data, the role of the more experienced leadership in the company was to fill in the gaps in the data. So you used your intuition to try and substitute for the data you didn't have. But that's no longer the case, because today there's no excuse. Today you actually have the data, it's getting generated. So then what's the role of leadership? Leadership's role is to make sure that people are doing those experiments, using the data generated from the experiments to take the right decisions. They're encouraging a lot more experimentation than before, and it's happening, by the way. So for example, recently I met a guy who is a manager in an online travel portal, and he said that one of his KPIs every quarter is that he has to do at least 50 experiments during the quarter. That's part of his key performance indicators for his performance measurement.
And there are many enterprises who have tried to imbibe this whole, what do you call as chief, you use the word orchestrator of experiments. So when you talk about, like, there are enterprises who have really pushed towards entrepreneurship and doing something interesting, creating newer ideas. Uh, and at least I do read about a very interesting example called Hire, how they've tried to do that in China and creating those small enterprises within
Sure,
them.
sure.
Are you really looking at those sets of things emerging in other parts of the world and really pushing forward?
Uh, Not to the same degree, I guess. In India, we have seen some examples of that. For example, I know that at Marico, Mr. Mariwala has been encouraging a lot of entrepreneurship. This whole Kaya skincare chain came out of some such experiment within the company. We many years ago we heard of people like Shiv Nadar in HCL encouraging people with entrepreneurial talent in the company to set out on their own and start new things. I think even NIIT was one of the very early experiments in that. So we've seen a little bit of that happening, but certainly not to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
extent that we would expect to see. I mean, it certainly should be much more than what we have seen in the past.
If you really look at when you were saying like you've seen some set of experiments here, do you think there can be a movement of sorts within the corporate sector to really push forward with this kind of agenda, to really make themselves more agile, more responsive, have more what I call enabling factors for creating competitive advantage and things?
Yeah, but it involves taking some fairly big risks, I think, or at least big leaps, let's say, maybe not risks. Also, it involves taking some big leaps. See, I think most businesses today are have the potential to become quasi digital. What I mean by that is, even if the product cannot be made or delivered digitally, a lot of the processes can be made digital so that you are able to generate a lot of data and use that data for innovation and so on. And essentially we are talking about things like IoT, robotic process automation, all that stuff. So it is possible to convert even a very traditional business into a quasi digital business. The moment you do that, it really enhances your ability to do a lot more experimentation than you were doing before. But I'm a little surprised that even when you talk to some of the established business houses in India and you try to understand their plans for even things like digitalization, they're not seeing the sort of the innovation angle to it. They're not seeing, they're still looking at it more as, let's reduce cost, let's try to enhance efficiency, let's reduce time and all that stuff, which I'm not poo-pooing that. I mean, those are all important, but the fact that it could actually give you a leap to do something very differently from the way you're doing it today is still something that many of even the larger groups are not quite embracing.
Oh, so that's an interesting point. Just moving ahead on with this, like we did talk about this very idea of say business model innovation. And where do you think, if I really, the next basis for competitive advantage, as I see it, as a lot of literature is talking about, is going to be innovation on business model or delivering services and things. And you have also talked about it's an experience economy that we are really getting into. Uh, how do you think product enterprises will be able to innovate to create newer business models, newer engagements, newer what I call experiences for people? Because that is what is going to drive them to enterprises, right? Maybe
Yeah.
I could be horribly wrong, but then
So I think the few things which are sort of becoming evident. The first one is the importance of collaboration, and the second one is the importance of strategic experimentation. I gave you the example of Ford earlier. If you look at Ford's trajectory in this whole mobility space, I think Ford was one of the auto companies which understood quite early that there's a whole new definition of mobility coming in. It's not just focused on the car, it's based on the entire sort of mobility experience. And they started collaborating with a whole lot of companies in very different domains, whether it be technology companies or just companies in different industries, to look at a whole lot of things, looking at things like uh, parking innovations, looking at things like service shuttles, looking at things like vehicle swap programs. I mean, they started looking at building a whole lot of new digital platforms which could enable movement in all these different areas. And they realized quite early that given their DNA as a car company, it might be quite difficult for them to pilot all these things themselves. So they got into a whole range of strategic alliances with other companies to pioneer some of these platforms. Of course, some of them didn't work and some of them had to be scrapped and all this, but this really enabled Ford to move forward quite fast. So, to my mind, these two elements seem to go very closely together. Your ability and willingness to collaborate with a whole range of players who might have been quite unconnected to your business earlier, and your willingness to not only collaborate but take some strategic bets, do some strategic experimentation along with those partners. The third thing I should add, which I forgot, is the importance of working with startups. Now, of course, it's a fashion. Everyone says, I'm working with startups, I have this, accelerator program and so on, but it's not easy. I mean, how do you structure things inside your company so that you can work effectively with startups so that you benefit? And there's no point in doing that and killing the startup, because then that will sort of kill the golden goose, right? So the startups DNA has also got to be preserved, and companies are in a way struggling. And I find in India particularly, companies have not been very thoughtful about how they structure these relationships with startups. Particularly the bigger guys tend to start looking very menacing to the startup, which will not really help, the kind of collaboration or the kind of alliance you're trying to build.
So, Rishi, you have alluded to the example of automotive company a number of times here. In fact, so let me ask you this funny question then. Like when you talk about, and you've also talked about Internet of Things, and you're talking about like how how do you think Internet of Things can actually have an impact on the automotive enterprise? Because we are talking about a very industry which was made on the basis of course, internal combustion engine, oil, and everything, but now it is going to be batteries. But there is something more that's going to happen.
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, I'm not an expert on the automobile industry, but I can see that people in the industry are trying to think very differently now, because I recently had some interaction with one of the big European automakers, and clearly they're very worried about whether their current model of doing things is going to work. And their biggest worry is not about other car companies, of course. Their biggest worry is about the Googles and Amazons of this world, getting into their space and eating up their things. So I don't think I should comment on IoT specifically, because that's not really my strength. But clearly, you were talking earlier about business models. You were talking about you know competition coming from unexpected kind of quarters. I think that's the big fear for many of those companies. And you must have read these comments said very often. Some of the biggest fears for established companies is that one of those guys, the FANG guys, are going to enter their space. And the moment they see that, they start getting worried. So I think that's a big challenge for them.
Mm-hmm. And so let me come to an industry that you have been operating in. And given the situation in the world today and how something like the interaction that we are doing now, this might not have happened exactly as you said 1 year back, and we are doing it right away. Uh, how do you think education will fundamentally change as we go along? Do you think the very structure of universities could change? Institutions like IIM Bangalore or other IIMs might change over a period of time, or they are going to be here to stay?
So I think, Amit, there are some very clear distinctions we need to make. I mean, when a student goes to a top ranked university or institution, one of them is of course the content. For example, learning how to formulate a strategy, or use Porter's five forces or something like that. Now that's one part of it. Now that's the part which could probably quite easily become online. Maybe you don't necessarily need all the education infrastructure that we have today to do that kind of learning. So that's one part of it. Second part is, the things where there's no black and white kind of an answer, the grays. And there are a lot of grays, right? It could be in terms of human resource management. It could be in terms of, ethical issues. It could be a whole lot of even strategic issues where, there are clearly multiple options. And prima facie, just on the basis of the data, you can't necessarily say one path is going to be the best, because there are a lot of uncertainties involved. So for all those grays where you need, where your typical case study classroom brings out all those trade-offs and all those difficult decisions you have to make, I don't see that. I mean, some amount of that discussion could of course be online, but I don't see that sort of just disappearing overnight. The third part of the education is the social part. And here are multiple dimensions to it. I mean, one of the big advantages of going to a big name university or business school is the network you build. I mean, the people you are classmates with today, at least historically, 20 years later, they're likely to be the CEOs of companies at that time. So that's a kind of, and the close connections you build with that network when you're going through a common social experience that is not, at least to the best of my knowledge, replicable online. So if I just break it up into these three parts, you can see the first one, yeah, for sure, online is going to do the trick, can do the trick. The second one, online can do up to a point, but the really rich, deep discussions, face to face discussions are much better. And the social part is almost irreplaceable, digitally. So depending, where you are on this spectrum. So let's say a student going for undergraduate education or going for a high end MBA, I don't see those things getting kind of disrupted overnight. But yeah, several other things could get disrupted. If I need to learn a particular skill because I need it for my job, or if I need to enhance or sharpen something, or need to learn a new technique, all of those things, yeah, for sure, could be done quite effectively online, and those are likely to shift in that direction. So I think it's a nuanced answer. I think it all depends on which kind of activity you're talking about.
Of course, like I agree with you on that, but then there is also an opportunity here as I see it. Like let's take a step back in terms of say, or let's look at the younger set. So when you talk about school and whatever, and in terms in a case like or in a place like India or Africa, where education outcomes are a big challenge,
Yeah.
maybe these technologies could actually help in a significant way.
Yeah, but again, you have other problems, right? Like for example, you know this very well. In MOOCs, for example, completion rates are quite low. Okay, so how are you going to create that stickiness with the learner? The learner stickiness will automatically get enhanced if the learner absolutely needs that to get ahead. Then you don't have so many motivational issues. But you think about school kid who's not doing terribly well, not that highly motivated, you're trying to learn everything online. Who's going to, or how are you going to help those kids really feel connected, or sort of feel some glue to the entire education process? So part of it historically came from the teacher, part of it came from fellow kids. If you're a little richer, it came from a tuition teacher or somebody like that. But how are you going to, basically create all that stickiness? Yes, the simple part of delivery, I agree with you, but it'll need to be complemented with other things, is what I think.
You yourself you said something very important here, and that was a tuition teacher, and suddenly you have a business model in an enterprise which was valued at $1 billion recently, and that was a tuition institution, and then it was picked up by another large enterprise. And
Yeah,
what is happening in that space? Like because uh, that's probably I'm not able to get a finger on the thing as to what's really happening and why those valuations, what's driving it. Because of that, learning is going to be hugely different. It's about social interaction. It's about that experience. If that's not happening, where is that valuation coming from, or is it just an hyped up situation?
yeah. Yeah, so I think, well, of course, people are trying to build a sort of network economies of scale, trying to get more people onto the same platform. So if you're already got certain products and then you can add on some more, which kind of create a pipeline to that. I mean, obviously you have a bigger network. You can try to exploit some of those network economies and so on. So I can see some of that consolidation game happening around creating those kind of network economies, trying to get to a kind of winner take all situation where you sort of dominate that space. So that seems to be what's happening right now in education, at least, particularly the kind of companies you were just referring to.
But then, what about the valuations? Like, how do you really look at those? Like, do you think they are realistic or non-realistic? If you want to answer that question, I don't want you to be, you know,
No, no. I mean, see, after all, it's very difficult today to say whether a particular valuation is worth it or not. I think we'll know about the correctness or otherwise of that valuation only in a few years going forward. Obviously, when there's a lot of hype around a sector, when there's some multiple players all jostling to become dominant in that sector, you're going to have exaggerated valuations. There's no doubt about that. Will they be able to convert those very high priced acquisitions into value later is an open question. But yeah, I mean, irrational exuberance is no stranger to us. We've seen it big time in the dot-com boom, and we are seeing elements of that even today.
no, that's an interesting one. But then, just moving this conversation ahead in terms of learning and idea of innovation and things. And how do you really look at this idea of creativity within individuals and how to propel that? Because that's what is really going to push forward this idea of innovation, looking at things differently, looking at
Yeah.
perspective and things.
Yeah. So let me give you an example which we wrote about in one of our books. This is from Titan, and Titan many years ago sort of had this idea. How do we get or tap into the creativity of people working in our company? And they had a sort of strong sense that yes, people do have creativity. The challenge is only how do we channelize that creativity into uses which will benefit the company. So one of the interesting things they did at that point of time was to set up what they call an innovation school of management. Very simple idea. They worked with one of the consulting firms, developed a 3-day workshop on creative problem solving skills, put all their employees in groups of 25 through that program. And then at the end of every program, the participants were given a project to work on. It's somewhat like the Googling, except that in Google, it's always about you choose the project, but here the company chose the project and said, okay, now you guys work on this project, you apply the creative problem solving skills you learned in the training and see what kind of difference you can make. And quite amazing. I mean, once we invited some of those folks from the shop floor in Titan to come and speak in one of our programs on campus. And initially, I was very skeptical. When I heard all this stuff, I thought this is again, some corporate, stuff, and does it really work in practice? But then when those guys from the shop floor came and explained, and they are not fancy guys at all. Not, hardly any of them could speak in English. They all spoke in their own mother tongue, but they explained so nicely how they had used all these creativity techniques to solve some of the problems they were facing in the workplace. Then I realized, hey, this can actually work if you create the right conditions. So they gave them time, they gave them mentorship, they sort of enabled their creative problem skills by getting this consulting firm to run some of those workshops, and presto, they were able, a lot of them were able to convert their individual creativity into some group innovation.
And so just on this, when you're talking about bringing the creativity about and how that whole process was done, what about looking at things from different fields of thought, like, or schools of thought? Like, because typically, like, what I see is that if you're really in a business school or an engineering school, you're not looking at other areas like, say, liberal arts or whatever. Do you think that's going to be an important aspect
Yeah,
for
absolutely. Yeah.
everybody?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think the field of innovation also tells you that sometimes you can get the best ideas from completely different fields. One of the best stories I once read about this was a children's hospital in London, where they get a lot of kids for emergency kind of treatment and so on. And at some particular point of time, they found their mortality rates in emergency care were going up. Essentially, something was going wrong. They were not able to take care of the kids' problems fast enough. So they started wondering, where should we look for ideas on how to fix this problem? So they started thinking about which is the industry in which there are significant coordination challenges which the industry is able to address in very short spans of time. And they realized the best example of this is F1 racing. When the car goes into the pit stop, you get just a few seconds in which the tires have to be changed, you have to refuel the car, the windshield has to be clean, all that stuff has to be done, and everything has to be just right. By the time that whatever number of seconds is finished, the driver has to be able to take off. And so they studied F1 pit stops, and then they realized some of the coordination mistakes they were making in the hospital, and they went and implemented that. So good ideas can come from very, very different areas.
That is fascinating. Fascinating. In fact, we are coming to a close for a conversation, but then just one question which what do you call is stuck in the mind in terms of, like, what are the major disruptions that can actually happen in the next few years, 5 to 10 years? Like, we are living through one disruption. What else that can actually define the world or redefine the world for us? And of course, there are some Elon Musk examples that you were suggesting, but what else do you think can actually drive them?
I don't, well, I'm not a very good, technology forecaster actually. But I think what would really be helpful for us in India is particularly some disruptions on the education and training front, which you already sort of identified. I think that's critical. We've been talking about all this skilling and all this demographic dividend for years, but we haven't really cracked that problem. So that's an area which is just waiting for some really disruptive changes to happen. Another one is probably transportation, which is today one of the biggest causes of pollution. It's a cause of all these big traffic jams and all the rest. So clearly, given our country's size, population density, and all that, disruptions in transportation are going to be very useful if we could really completely reimagine the way we do the whole transportation sector. And the third would be an obvious one, would be healthcare. I mean, it's very obvious that we cannot afford to reproduce or replicate the healthcare system which is in the developed world. We simply don't have the resources today. We are unlikely to have the resources going forward. But we have a lot of good Indian examples of people who have really brought down the costs of healthcare. How can we, basically take all those ideas and do some disruption on a much larger scale so that we can provide high quality universal healthcare at a reasonable cost? I think that's an area just waiting for disruption. I don't know the answers to these questions, but these are all the, I think, areas where disruption would really help.
And if I just follow it up with another point and seek your views, like when you talk about this whole idea of jugaad, like there seems to be this. Is it a right thing to do, or is it the nemesis? Because from my point of view, jugaad is about shortcuts. It's just not right. It's just not appropriate. How do you really look at this whole idea?
So yeah, I think we've discussed this several times, on multiple platforms. I think this jugaad thing has got, people have got a bit confused about it. There's one part of jugaad which is good. That is the whole ingenuity that people exercise to solve problems they are facing. If you don't have that urge to do that, you'll probably not be a good innovator anyway. So that's a good part of jugaad. And sometimes you do that within the constraints you have, using the available materials in your context. It's also a good way of innovating. The problem is when you do this in such a way that it's not scalable, because you do some quick fix, as you said, you do some shortcut that works only the one time you do it. It's not going to work for anybody else. That's not going to work anymore. I think we've just seen that today's customers, today's users, they want quality and low cost at the same time. Nobody is going to put up with a lousy product just because it costs less money. To my mind, it was the Nokia cell phone, that very simple Nokia 1100 or whatever it was, that was launched, say, about 15 years ago, which essentially, it did everything you want to do. You could make a call, you could send a text message. It had a small screen. It was very reliable. You chuck it on the floor, nothing would happen to it. That's when people realize that, all this jugaad stuff is not good enough. You need something that's robust. You need something that's scalable and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but it does all the functions you want it to do. So that, I think, is that's the challenge for jugaad.
Perfect. And I have a very interesting question from the audience. And the question is, would incorporating Tintin and Asterix comics at school level make us all more innovative? And that's a question for you.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, see, again, the problem with things like comics and all is they tend to be a little passive. You see, Professor Anil Gupta, one of my former and very respected teachers, one of the things he talks about is the difference between download and upload. So, India, we download a lot of stuff. We basically watch YouTube videos and all. But historically, we didn't upload enough. Of course, now we are uploading more, not always in the best interest of the country, though. But anyway, that's a different story. But I think that's the problem with comics. It's a bit in the download mode. It's not in the upload mode. So I would be happy if kids are encouraged to, make the next Asterix comic or the next Tintin comic rather than reading the old ones.
No, that's fascinating. And my last question to you, Rishi, like we have talked about innovation and things, but and it's a very what do you call important as a system or an ecosystem that we need to actually have. But what do you think we should do for the future as individuals and as a country?
I think I already hinted at some of those things. I think today, India is in many ways no longer a poor country. We have the resources available. Particularly, middle class India has the resources to experiment. We need to encourage, particularly our kids, to go on new paths. We need to encourage them to try things out. We need to be willing to tolerate a lot more failure. For that, we have to get out of the way. We have to let kids make their own mistakes, learn from mistakes, not sort of be very overly protective and try to sort of all the time tell them what to do. So I think that's, to me, that seems to be the most important thing that we need to do. And the second one, of course, which I sort of hinted at earlier, is the education system. Make it much more open-ended, make it more exploratory, no ready-made answers. Let people find out for themselves, let them find answers. I think that's the way to go. And we have quite some way to go on that as well.
And anything for enterprises?
Enterprises, I think the core thing is, again, it's a similar thing. We have to encourage much more experimentation. People have ideas, but we're not encouraging them to run with those ideas. So I gave you examples earlier. People like Marico and to some extent other groups like Tata's, and several of them. And of course, today the other thing is we've got some really smart startups in the country. I sometimes meet some of these guys. They've got really good ideas. Can we encourage these guys? And I think one thing I would mention there is, can we have more open-hearted and generous investment by established companies in some of these startups? We're not seeing enough of them. We're not seeing people opening their purse strings. We have some of the richest people in the world in India. They should be really opening their purse strings much more to give a fillip to these young entrepreneurs with really great ideas. Obviously, many of them won't work, but what the hell? I mean, I think we can afford to invest that money in encouraging them.
But I have to ask you this question on purse strings, and I have to put you in the corner on this question. And that is, people with big purse strings can actually invest in educational institutions abroad, but they are not supporting research here in educational institutions here. Why does that happen?
I think it's a bit complex, actually, in the sense that, I think, historically we've always liked to have these foreign connections. It's just like a foreign product is always valued more than a local product. Similarly, we like to have that respect and we want to be, linked up to those foreign networks. So I would much rather have my name associated with a classroom at Wharton or Harvard than, in India. Also in India, historically, a lot of the education has been in the government sector, but that's changing now. So I think hopefully with more private institutions coming in, and we have seen some really good private institutions in recent years. So hopefully we'll see some amount of the corporate money and philanthropy and all going into making those universities really very good.
Thank you, Rishi. This has just been a very, very interesting conversation. I just learned quite a bit. So it's all about innovation. It's about creating an ecosystem, and it's an effort that every one of us will actually have to push forward with, either as individuals, as corporations, and as the government. Rishi, thanks a lot for joining us for this episode of Thinkers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. Wonderful. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.